Okay. So today, what we'll do is we'll discuss about uh, uh, brief overview what we are going to discuss uh, in the course, and we'll derive our discussion from the facts we will observe for the world, maybe for the world as well as for India, for a considerable time period. I believe most of you have been following newspaper or news items. If you are following news items, probably you come across some news heading such as these. Like these are the news headings for India, and probably you might have come across such news heading in recent past also. What these news headings are telling, that GDP of India is likely to be contract by 23.9%. And this is very consistently reported by many of the news agencies. So the natural question arises, how these news agencies reached at such numbers? In India, we have a ministry called Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementations. Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementations. Under this ministry, we have one organization called CSO, Central Statistical Organization. These organizations generate these numbers. Over the course of this subject, we'll understand how these numbers are generated. Not only for India, we'll have overview in general, where we'll understand how this GDP, which is part of what we call is national income accounting. National income accounting. National income accounting are conducted by all countries, most of the countries in the world. So as we see here, these news agencies are reporting India's GDP growth will contract by 23.9%. And if we look at the CSO a report from which they had taken. This is the quarterly estimate of expenditure on GDP in uh, quarter one, that is April to June 2021. You see here, this is directly taken from CSO, and the link for the same will be provided in the PPT after 2-3 slides. And here we see CSO is reporting 22.6% contraction in India's GDP. However, the news agencies have reported 23.9% decline in our GDP. The difference, because of here, we are looking at current prices GDP. Whereas these news agencies reported what is called as the constant prices. Constant prices or real GDP. So if we look at the constant prices for India, you see the constant prices are at 2011-12 prices. Here we observe that GDP is contracting by 23.9%. So these constant prices are known as your real GDP compared to the current prices, which is known as your nominal GDP. So the case of constant prices or in case of real GDP, since we are keeping our price levels fixed at a particular year, so the monetary value of goods and services produced in that country will increase from that base year, for which we are keeping the prices constant, only when the quantities of goods and services we are producing increases. Therefore, this real GDP or the constant price GDP can be a good proxy for understanding the living standard. Understanding the living standard. However, this living standard proxied by our real GDP, though it is a very good proxy, but there are some limitations as well. We'll not venture into those limitations now. We'll discuss them when we'll discuss how to measure our GDP. For the time being, we can take this real GDP as a substitute or a proxy for our living conditions. So, as I said, these numbers are from MOSFI, and the link for the same is provided here. You are advised to visit this website and look for the recent informations about India's GDP and what is the expected progress or contraction of India's GDP. So this is your homework. You have to go visit those website and visit this website particularly, and then look for India's GDP situation. So we are using this terminology GDP, that is your gross domestic product, though we'll define it as well as we'll see how to measure it. But for the time being, we can say that GDP is the monetary value of final goods and services an economy is producing in a given time period. For instance, in this case, whatever we are producing in the Q2, that is July to September, and their money, we are converting those goods and services to monetary value using market prices, and we are calculating our GDP. So if you look at India's GDP for the last few years, we see it has been increasing over the time period. Same thing we'll observe, the same thing in the sense the rising trend will observe also for per capita income. So let me state it here that our per capita income is not equal to, strictly speaking, our per capita GDP. So per capita income is national income of the country divided by the populations, and GDP, per capita GDP, is equal to your GDP divided upon your populations. And national income and GDP are not the same thing, though there is a considerable overlap between these two. What we mean by this national income and how it is considerable, having a considerable overlap with per capita GDP, we'll discuss when we'll discuss measurement of our GDP and its different concepts. So looking at these two graphs, you see the rise in gross domestic product is more pronounced than that of your per capita income. So we can say GDP growth rate is higher than that of your per capita income. The this figure, these numbers, you can get it from Mosby, and another source for India's statistics is RBI, Reserve Bank of India, and you can visit those and see. And if you are interested to look at for any other country's economic progress, you have World Bank database known as your World Development Indicators. They, where you can see other countries' progress in terms of economic as well as non-economic indicators. So I advise you to visit those websites and check, at least for India, how India's progress has been. And if you visit the RBI website, you can visit to the publications and where you have handbooks of statistics on Indian economy. And I advise you to at least see the recent these two tables, macroeconomic aggregate at current prices and at constant prices. So this is the sources from which we get some idea about the recent economic progress of India. If we look at as the world as different countries of the world for a very long time period in terms of their real gross domestic product per capita, and we plot them, we see a trend like this. We can generate a graph like this. So what are the things we can observe from this graph? Anyone will, what are your observations? Say someone has, so this is your real gross domestic product per capita, and these are the countries for which we have plotted. If we plot for other countries as well, you will have similar picture. So what are the things you can note out of these? Yeah.
Around 2000 year, like GDP of all the countries has started growing very fastly.
Yes.
Like
Not
rate of change increased very much.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Like what you said.
Sir, I think
So
it started from 1900 because after the Industrial Revolution, all countries started developing more and more industries. So
yeah,
maybe the reason.
you are also absolutely right. See, if you see, we have these industrial revolutions, maybe second half of the 17th century here around. And you see some countries, particularly since this industrial revolution, which started in Europe, particularly in Britain, uh, the current UK, you see those countries started to increase their per capita income. And if you see prior to this for almost 1000 years or 700 years for which we have this graph, the all countries were in the flat land. In the sense, there is hardly any difference. There is hardly any difference amongst these countries. But since maybe 1700s, maybe after that, some countries start to break out from this flat land and start to grow. And the breakout point is different for different countries. So UK started maybe 1700. If you foresee India, it started somewhere in the 19th century, and it for China and India, it started particularly sorry in the second half of the 19th century. The country, now if we observe the difference here, the country which had started to break away from this flat land earlier, now they are much more developed in terms of, or they have a much more per capita GDP in constant at constant prices than those who break away later. In fact, in 14th century, around this time period, there was one Moroccan scholar named Ibn Battuta, who visited India, particularly Bengal in India. What he had observed, he had noted then that he didn't see any country in the world where the provisions, where rice is so abundant and the provisions are so plentiful. What he might have observed, then India was not much poorer than other countries, nor India was much richer than other countries. However, he noticed, however, he noticed the rich and poor differences within a particular region was subject to the titles given to some families. For instance, in India, he had observed that those who are royals or the landlords, they were the rich one, whereas those who are peasants or the servants, they were the poor one. So is the case for other countries. So there was not much difference between regions of the world in that 14th century, but there was difference within a particular region between rich and poor, which was mostly driven by the titles given to some families. So your if you born in, say, in 14th century, whether you will be rich or poor, it was not your location of your birth is going to decide. But if you are born to particular families, if you are born to royals or the servants, that will decide whether you will be rich and poor. And even in current world, whether you will be rich or poor, mostly driven by where your parents are in the economic ladder. So these 2 points, as two of you have mentioned, we observe from this. So we see there was little inequality between the countries or among the countries prior to 1700. But after that, now you see the inequality has increased considerably amongst the countries. But what has happened to inequality within the countries, which Batuta might observe then also? There was difference of rich and poor within a particular region. Let's have a look at how this inequality say within a country for, let's say, some time period. So
Sir,
yeah,
sir, since UK just ruled over India around 200 years, would their income be considered in GDP, the Indian income?
so what you're saying is when UK ruled India,
Yeah,
the income they might have generated in India. That
yeah,
is what you're saying, isn't it so?
yeah. They might have generated from India. Would that be considered in their GDP?
GDP. Yes, we will define that. When we are saying what is GDP, GDP, as I said, is the monetary value of goods, final goods and services a country is producing within the political boundary of a country. Within the political boundary of a country, uh, within a specific, given a specific time period. So this political boundary, what is the political boundary of UK then? If their political boundary is inclusive of the colonies they had, then whatever goods and services were produced in those colonies were also part of their GDP. For instance, you don't go back to so old, but say consider nowadays, you have some islands, okay, which are French island, like uh, uh, French colonies, and still some of them are French island. So, or Britain Island, since some of the islands are still under the rules of the Britain. If the colonies then were, as you are saying, ruled by, So if they are governing those colonies, so whatever they will produce in that colonies also be part of their GDP. This is particularly one of the concepts we'll also discuss a bit in when we'll discuss how to measure GDP. But if you fast forward to today, mostly these political boundaries as well as your geographical boundaries are more or less same, isn't so? So now we don't have uh, uh, countries taking over other countries and ruling them so forth in the modern world. So that is very limited. But if they do so, then if say India take over another country, let's say X or Y, then whatever will produce in the country X and Y, they will also be part of India's GDP. That is what we call. Okay, is it fine?
Yes, sir.
Oh, so what we are discussing was how this inequality has been shaping over the time period. These are the three graphs which illustrate how inequality our world has been and how inequality changing in the world over the time. Let me just briefly tell you how these graphs are uh, prepared so that uh, you will better understand what this means. So what we have done is initially in 1980, we have arranged the countries from poor countries to the rich countries in this x-axis. And here, what we have done is we have divided the country's populations into 10 groups. So the bottom 10 in terms of 10 groups in terms of their income levels. So the bottom 10 is the poorest 10% of the populations, and so here you have the bottom 10%, and here you have the rich 10% population. So here we have for each group we have a bar graph. So that represent the average uh, uh, average income of those 10% of the populations. So the first graph here, first bar for each country represent the average income of this country. Similarly, the next 10% and so forth. That is why you can see there are steps. So the average income you can see of the 10% population has been increasing. So this front bar graphs represent the bottom 10% population average income, whereas the back 10 bar graph, which you can see very high in some cases, is the average income of the richest 10% of that country's populations. If you uh, see, so do you follow how these graphs are prepared?
Yes.
Okay. So if you see here, the first graph, the backside backside bars even for the poorer countries, they are very small, and this has increased here. You can see become taller and taller, and here you can see the bumpiness at the background. So that represents the richest 10% average income has increased much more than that of the poorest 10%. You can see at the front bar. So that is suggestive of there is a rise in inequality within the country, and this is we can capture by what we call is 90/10 ratio. This 90/10 ratio is nothing, it's a very crude measure of inequality, but that represents how unequal, or if you want to see for any society how unequal, this 90/10 ratio is a very crude way of looking at inequality. So what is this 90/10 ratio? This 90/10 ratio is you take the average income of richest 10% of the population divide it by the average income of poorest 10% of the population. So this is nothing but the average income of richest 10% of population is nothing but the average income of 90th percentile, average income of 90th percentile, and this one is nothing, average income poorest 10% is nothing but average income of bottom 10 or 10th percentile, bottom 10th percentile. That is why it is called 90/10 ratio. If I, let's say, if I can plot any country's income, so like this in a then if I divide this income into 10 groups like this, so this is my the 10th percentile, and this is my 50th percentile or my median, and then this is my 90th percentile. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the average income of the populations here and dividing it by the average income of this population here. So that is why this 90/10 ratio. So what we observe in terms of this 90/10 ratio is even for the most equal societies we consider today, such as the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Switzerland, Netherlands, and so forth, even for them, this 90/10 ratio is bit high. For example, for Norway, the 90/10 10 ratio is 5.4. What it implies is, on an average, the richest 10% of Norwegian population have income 5.4 times than that of the poorest 10% of the Norwegian population. And this 90/10 ratio is quite high for poorer countries. For example, if you consider Botswana, one of the sub-Saharan countries, the 90/10 ratio is around 145. And for India, it is 22. So what we observe from these thing is the inequality within a country also increased. And as we see earlier, inequality among the countries has increased. In fact, if we compare the poorest in a rich country, poorest in a, let's say, poorest 10% of rich country, with the richest of poor country, we observe a very much difference. But for example, if you take the poorest Norway's, 10% of Norway's poorest, and compare that with the, let's say, 10% of your Nigeria richest, we see the poorest 10% of Norway on an average twice the income of the richest 10% of Nigeria. So this is one of the observations we make. So we see a country. So what we observe from this set of graphs is, for a very long time, countries' standard of living, which we proxied by our per capita GDP in constant prices, didn't increase much. But once they started to increase, they increase the breaking point, or the if you look at this graph, we can say this is sort of a hockey stick type of graph. So where you have this flat land, then we have a kink. So the kink happened for different countries at different point of time, leading to vast difference in the living standard around the world. At the same time, we also see there is rise in inequality within the countries. This is what we that is what we call is this hockey stick growth of our living standard. And what we observe from those set of graphs, that is two things we learn. That is, for a very long time, living standard did not grow in any sustained way. When sustained growth occurred, it began at different times in different countries, leading to vast difference in living standard around the world. And understanding how this has happened has been one of the important questions that economists have asked, starting from the founding of the founder of the field as considered in modern economics, Adam Smith, who wrote a book named as An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nation. So Adam Smith asked a question that time when he wrote the book in 1776. That in a world, the economic actors such as your producers, consumers, transporters, traders, those economic actors located at different part of the world, most often that not, they are unknown to each other. How those economic actors are coordinating. So that time we didn't have these IT revolutions where uh, uh, we may know each other very quickly, but that time how those economic actors located at different geographical locations and unknown to each other were coordinating amongst themselves. His claim was those economic actors were coordinated amongst themselves not because someone is forcing upon them. There is no someone in the sense there is no institutions or there is no ruler or some third party is forcing upon them those to coordinate, but they are coordinating because of their self-interest. And this has been a new idea that these economic agents the producers, sellers, traders, consumers, transporters, those economic actors are coordinating amongst themselves because of their self-interest, and nobody or no institution is imposing them to coordinate themselves. This is very radical in the sense at that time uh, we had kings or rulers, those who are imposing orders in their subjects, orders on their maybe citizens. But his idea was different. So you have a king and who will say order some uh, say some rules or regulations on them. But here he was claiming those economic actors were not governed by those rulers or a third party, but it is because of their self-interest. In fact, he had a very interesting statement to make. I quote, what is his statement? It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. What it means? It means that the dinner we are getting, it is not because those who are providing it, they are selfless. They want to do maybe social good and so forth. They are doing this. Not because of that. We are getting our dinner and they are providing it because they have their self-interest. And Adam Smith observed the prosperity we had observed maybe around that 17th century, particularly in Europe, is because of what he meant by division of labor. What is this division of labor, and how this is been linked to that prosperity we'll discuss in the next class.